Hello, I'm Steve Balch, Director of the Texas Tech Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, and this is another of our Institute Encounters, in which we interview some of the distinguished guests who we bring to the university to give a lecture under our auspices. And today we have a very distinguished, multi-skilled a professor of political science and classics. He's actually the Constantine Mitsotakis Professor of Political Science at Stanford. It's a very long title, which I'm abbreviating with his permission, but that's the essence of it. His name is Josiah Ober, and he is interesting in that he not only writes wonderful books, but he also combines the skills of a political theorist, a political analyst, deploying the various tools of political economy theory and rational choice. He is a person who has done some archaeology and is familiar with the cutting-edge work in archaeology now being done on classical antiquity. And he's written a series of books about democratic theory and about democracy in Athens. These include Master and Elite in Democratic Athens, Political Dissent in Democratic Athens, Democracy and Knowledge, Innovation and Learning in Classical Athens. That I got it right there. Rise and Fall of Classical Greece, a book that I've had a chance to read and very much enjoyed, and Demopolis, Democracy Before Liberalism. Of course, he's written many other articles and is quite esteemed very widely for his kind of range of thought and a very interesting analysis. So I want to welcome you here. Thank you for joining us. And let me begin by sort of posing a problem at a rather general level, a problem we've taken up. And I think the problem of much interest to many people in the United States today. What is a democracy? You've taken this up because you're trying to apply the concept to ancient Greece and Athens, but of course it's a question of very broad import. What are your views on that?
So, having spent much of my life trying to figure out how it could be that a very direct form of democracy could work in an ancient city-state with a population of, say, 250,000 people total, whom 30 to 50,000 were participating citizens, seemed to me a very hard problem to explain how that could work over time. Took me several books to get it sorted out, at least to my own satisfaction. I wanted in my last book on Demopolis to back up from the particularities of the ancient world and ask, what is a democracy, and what is necessary for a democracy to exist? What are the conditions that are necessary for the most basic form of democracy? So in the Demopolis book, I ask the reader to hold at bay any assumptions they have about the relationship between democracy and liberalism. Either the classical liberalism of 18th, 19th century, or contemporary liberalism of the academic sort that we'd associate with, for example, the philosophy of John Rawls. So, not saying this is good or bad, just hold it at bay. And then ask what is democracy when you haven't brought that in. And so the answer ultimately is non-tyranny. That democracy is not being ruled by a boss. The only alternative to being ruled by a boss, a king, a junta, some group that constitutes itself as, as a ruling coalition. The only alternative is that we rule ourselves, that we find out some way in which we can collectively make the kind of rules enforce the kind of rules that will allow us to do two things. Two things that I think every workable society has to do if it's going to sustain itself, and that is to ensure its own security, both internal and external, against external rivals and against internal social collapse, and then at least basic welfare, such that people are living far enough above bare subsistence that they are able to pursue other projects in their life beyond just simply ruling themselves. Because if democracy becomes so all-encompassing and that ruling ourselves takes over everything, we have no chance of pursuing other interests, whether they're religious or economic, personal, whatever they may be, then it's obviously not worth the candle.
So the question that arises, if that's the definition, is that it doesn't seem to be dependent on the size of the franchise, on how many people can vote.
Right. So the point is that for a democracy to be meaningful, at least so I would argue, there has to be an extensive citizenship, because to say that, well, there's a population of 250,000 people, 10 of them are ruling, they call themselves citizens, therefore we have a democracy because the citizens are ruling, is simply fallacious. So the argument that I make is that for it to be called a democracy, that the citizenship has to include everyone who is culturally imaginable at that time as a citizen. So if we're thinking about ancient Athens, what turns out to be culturally imaginable is the adult native male population. Mm-hmm. And the culture had, to my mind, regrettably, not taken on board the possibility of including women as citizens, had not taken on board the idea that you could find ways to naturalize outsiders, at least not in large numbers, but had taken on the thought that even people without property, even adult native males who were poor, were capable of being in the body of those who share in ruling. And that's the radical moment. Of course, there is no Western society that achieves universal native manhood suffrage until the 19th century. So Athens was doing something pretty dramatic pretty early on. And this is why, for example, Sparta is not a democracy. Sparta has an extensive citizenshiip, maybe 9,000 people in the archaic Greek period, but the natives of Laconia include tens of thousands of helots who are excluded from citizenship. They are native adult males. They're perfectly imaginable in the wider Greek cultural imaginary as citizens, and they're systematically excluded from any sort of participation in government, and therefore no Greek ever argued that Sparta was a democracy.
So you're saying in each particular culture there's a notion of who the political peerage is, who the people are who could and should be able to participate in government. But in some places, even though there is that supposition, it's that recognition, they're not allowed to, and that's not democratic. But if they are allowed to, so you have a property franchise. What does that mean in terms of whether you're democratic or not?
Yeah, and so it depends really about where you are, right? So by the time we're in the middle of the 17th century in England, there certainly is imaginable to have universal manhood suffrage, the levelers say. And so therefore, by the definition, it is fully imaginable, and therefore those who...
How many people have to imagine it before it's fully imaginable?
And so there you get into, but certainly there was a lot of people
so
among
in the antebellum South, were they a democracy?
Well, I think they were, it depends on where we are in the antebellum South. Certainly the case that by the time we're in the Jim Crow South, it is not, because systematically people who are not only imagined as, but are legally citizens, are being excluded from citizenship.
Well, what about under slavery?
Well, under slavery, I think that it is depends on whether you say the South has its own social imaginary that is immune to what's going on in the North, and I think that would be a specious claim. So in the antebellum South, there's huge energy in justifying slavery. They have to try to bring in Aristotle. There's a whole industry in trying to shore up what is clearly yes, they're having a hell of a time defending it, and they try to. But I think it's because the imagination of citizenship had in fact extended beyond, and therefore they're fighting a rearguard action, just as oligarchs were in classical Greece. One of my former students, shout out to Matt Simonton, wrote a brilliant book recently on Greek oligarchy, and his point is that against the theories that have long been prominent, oligarchy is not the natural form of government, at least once the imagination of citizenship is extended out as far as it had in Greece, and that oligarchy was a kind of a very carefully sustained and very skillfully sustained system of exclusion that had to be really worked at very hard in the same way that the antebellum South.
So it would be fair to say that this is a fairly, in a sense, an expansive notion of democracy, because it's a kind of relativized notion of
exactly
democracy.
So. Exactly so.
Things that, but one might ask in that case, isn't the kind of democracy that one had in ancient Athens a smaller percentage of the population than in democracies in the modern world, a more homogeneous, for a variety of reasons, part of the population than elsewhere? Isn't that going to operate rather differently from mass democracy, say, in contemporary America?
Necessarily. So in order to understand how a particular democracy works, if you want to really get into the details, you're going to have to know a lot about it. You have to know a lot about the cultural background. You have to know a lot about the values, and especially you'll have to know a lot about the actual institutional mechanisms that are allowing things to work or breaking down when things aren't working. It's certainly true that by our standards, the Athenian citizen population was culturally homogeneous. By their standards, it was wildly diverse. So if you read Plato, writing in the under the democracy, lived under the Athenian democracy his whole life, what he says is that democracy is the form of government that embraces freedom, equality, and diversity. He calls it multicolored, and what he means by that is that people have all kinds of different opinions about how to live their life, and they pursue those things quite freely. The difference between the wealthy elite, the highly educated, everybody else was considered to be a huge a challenge for keeping the democracy together. So once again, if we go inside the Athenian world, instead of looking at it from our point of view, we go back and say, oh, look at how homogeneous this society is. For the Athenians, they said, look at how diverse we are, and look at what a challenge we have to make a diverse society like this actually work, so that rich man can sit next to a poor man in the assembly. Both of them raise their hand, or one of them raises their hand and the other doesn't when it comes to a vote, and those votes are counted equally, and neither of them goes out of the assembly saying it's time for civil war. Now, for the Athenians, that was a big accomplishment.
So Athenian democracy is reasonably successful. It lasts, with a few interruptions, for what, two and a half centuries?
Close to 200 years.
Close to 200 years.
And then it doesn't fall apart from its own internal contradictions. It's overthrown by Macedonian conquerors.
from our point of view, the Athenian electorate looks pretty homogeneous. From the inside, it looked different. From our point of view, it looks homogeneous. Was that relative homogeneity compared to what the modern world looks like? Was that a strength, or was that a weakness, or what? What would you say, looking at how Athens actually fared over its democratic history?
Right. So this goes back to thinking about this Demopolis book and how it's sort of meant to use the Athenian example to think about where we are. So on the one side, what I argue is that some set of common commitments are necessary for a democracy. If there's no sense of a common interest in at least security and welfare, basic security, basic welfare, if there isn't some agreement that each of us who is a member of this society, who has citizenship in this community, ought to be able to and ought to be willing to participate in sustaining those conditions, right? And if there isn't some agreement about what it takes to sustain those conditions, then I think democracy is impossible. So that homogeneity in certain core commitments. On the other hand, so I argued in another book on democracy and knowledge, the strength of democracy is in its epistemic diversity. So we tend to think of diversity today as being ethnic or gender or about race, but I think that the core necessity for a democracy to work well is that there be a diversity in what is known among the citizenship. A diversity of skills, a diversity of experiences, a diversity
Sounds like the Austrian economist in you here speaking out.
Well, this is, and in fact, in that book, the epigraph, I have three epigraphs, but one of them is Friedrich Hayek. So the idea that you bring together a multiplicity of different ways of knowing, Hayek thought that's how you develop a price mechanism, and that's how the economy works. But the argument in this book is that that's how a democracy works, that a democracy is a system for aggregating diverse knowledge, for solving collective problems.
So some people would say that that's the great virtue of a market. When it comes to politics, I think you have to make a harder argument. It's true. I mean, one of the things it would seem to me that Athenian democracy realized was it was able to, on critical occasions, unite the different strata of the population to keep the state going, to enable it to survive. But in what sense would you say, in its deliberations, in terms of actual cases you can think of, in its deliberations, did that ability of epistemic diversity turn into a useful decision-making process? How did that work?
Right. So suppose that, for example, you have to decide whether to fight the great Persian Navy in 480 BC, or whether to abandon the city and flee to some place in the western Mediterranean collectively, or whether to build a wooden wall up on the citadel of the Acropolis. You've got sort of three options that have kind of emerged. How are you going to decide what to do? This is an existential problem. It's got to be a collective decision. We've got to get on board with it, but how are you going to decide to do that, or what you should do? Well, you've got to know various things. You've got to know what is the effective capacity of the fleet. Okay, Athens has recently built a fleet, but very recently built a fleet. Is it ready to go? Okay, somebody who's a general can say, yes, I believe it is. But unless the people who actually row in the fleet know that, they are collectively willing, or each of their fellow citizens who's actually going to be putting his body on the line is willing to do that, whether they think these ships are ready to go, that the training is ready to go. you're not going to have an ability to make the best decision on that. If you don't have people who know about what the local winds are off the island of Salamis, where you might decide to take your stand, you're going to be in trouble. That's local knowledge that you're only going to have. Some people who live in a very particular part of your society are going to have that. If they don't contribute that knowledge, you're going to be in trouble.
But why can't the leader, like Themistocles, just consult with various people who know those things and make his decision on that basis?
But see, the question then is imagine that Themistocles, as the leader, was a king. And previously, as king, he had simply given people orders. Like it or not, you take his orders because he has coercive power. All right? And now the king says, I order you to tell me the truth about the things that I need to know to make the decision that will keep me in power. What do you say? I don't really know too much about those winds. The whole question is, why do people disclose what they know, especially when what they know is sometimes proprietary knowledge?
So it's a feeling, it's not so much a decision-making process you're talking about here, it's the feeling of having a stake, and hence of being willing to come forward and make a collective decision and contribute your part wisely as best you can.
That's exactly right. So so it is the feeling that you do have a stake. That's why you're willing to disclose. That's why you're willing to pay the costs of disclosing what might be valuable proprietary information. But then the process is, and this is, I think, the sort of secret sauce of why a democracy works or fails, is that you have some system that is able to sort out what is the useful inputs into a decision-making process. So you get the guy who knows about winds popping up, and the guy who knows about readiness of the sailors to sail popping up, somebody who knows has a strategic plan, and you have to have a way to put those things together into a proposal, and that's where leadership comes in. So that's where a guy like Themistocles can bring in those pieces.
Was there a mass meeting before Salamis?
There was. Herodotus describes this meeting in really in a good amount of detail. So the citizens of Athens, the adult native males, got together in this mass meeting, as they did regularly. Herodotus says many opinions were offered. He says that the expert oracle readers said that it was a lost cause, we ought to flee. And then the elders said, no, the ships are too dangerous, we should build this wooden wall up on the Acropolis. But in the end, the decision is made to do the really bold thing, and that is fight at sea.
Some people build a wall.
Some people did build a wall and went and stood behind it and died. But the point here is that you have various kinds of authority that in other societies would simply have determined the case. So the king calls out his expert oracle interpreters and says, all right, expert oracle interpreters, what should we do? And if the king trusts his oracle interpreters, fine, that's what we do. Or we have a society in which the elders make the decisions and the young men simply take the orders from the elders. In that case, they would have built the wooden wall and they all would have died. It's only because this was a society in which the inputs were not determined by some kind of established expertise that couldn't be trumped or some kind of established authority that had to be respected, that the whole of the citizenry was able to come up with a judgment and then get behind it. So that's the real key, is that once we've made a decision, once we've had a process in which I, as a citizen, believe that I've had a real part in, and I had my say, or maybe I didn't have my say this time because I don't know anything that's valuable, so I'm going to listen to other people who do have something that's valuable about this particular decision. Some other decision I may have something, not this one. In the end, then, we listen to it, we come up with the best judgment we can, and now we're going to vote on it, and we need to get behind it. Because if we don't get behind it, we can't find something that we can, most of us anyway, a supermajority of us can say, yeah, this is the right way to go, then we're going to be in trouble.
So for the way you're describing it, it seems to me that it actually has two features. One feature is a decision-making process in which most people feel that they at least potentially can have voice.
That's right.
But the second thing is a sense, some sort of sense of common identity and interest. You could have a majoritarian system in which there was real polarization.
That's right.
One side prevails and the other side really feels we have nothing in common with these other guys, so it's going to fail as well. And you're saying that in Athens and in a good functioning democracy, you probably need both those things.
That's right. So one of the basic ideas that a lot of my work has been driven by, at least in recent years, is the idea that democracy being defined as majority rule in the first instance is a mistake. That the core meaning of democracy, take it to the Greek term, the demos, the people, have the power, the kratos. So what do we mean by the demos? We mean the whole of the citizen body, not just some. And by kratos, power, doesn't mean power to dominate if we happen to get 51%. At least so I've argued. It means the capacity to do things together. And the word democracy, in its core meaning, is the collective capacity of people to do things together. That is non-tyranny, right? We don't need a boss to tell us what to do. We can together do it. But we don't do it by getting a bare majority of us imposing our will on a minority, and we don't do it in finding ways that systematically excludes substantial minorities.
So it sounds a little bit like our national motto, e pluribus unum. You have many and you have one. You have one when you need to have one.
That's correct.
But you have many feeding into the one.
That's correct, exactly so. And I think, and then is the idea of you are, as a citizen of a democracy, an individual, you have your own opinions, you have your own interests, you know some special things, you have some particular talents, and those are your own. But you contribute what is relevant of that to the community as necessary because you recognize that it is of value. It is the only way that you'll be able to run things without having a boss. Now this just depends on having a society that has made a pre-commitment to the idea that not having a boss is an important thing because you're going to have to do some work that you wouldn't have to do if you simply outsourced.
Was that the political default position in ancient Greece, or was it just something that happened in Athens and a few other places?
It happened early on in Athens and in a few other places. The default position, I think, in Greece is the idea that some subset of the citizen body ought to be, and some fairly extensive subset, ought to be running things instead of just one family.
So kingship and tyranny were bad.
Kingship and tyranny get pushed out of at least the primary legitimate ways of running things pretty early. What happens in Athens and a few other places is that you extend out this idea that some subset of the citizens should do things to the whole of the citizens should be able to do things. And then the question is, will it work? And the answer is yes. What we see over time is that democracy tends to outperform oligarchy. And there are more conversions from oligarchy to democracy than there are from democracy to oligarchy. There are a lot of political revolutions in the Greek world, but over time, democracy is just outperforming oligarchy. And I think this is because it just turns out to be a better way to organize a society to generate levels of welfare and security.
And where you have democracy in the Greek world, you have direct participation. It's basically collective decision-making. Every person who wants to be part of it can be.
That's right. That's right. And this is really the key. I think this is the great challenge for a contemporary democracy is how do you get citizens to have the sense of owner things when it's impossible for us all to come together in a assembly, and when the possibility of some sort of deep consensus about, all right, we're going to choose to do this and we're going to all get behind it is much, much harder. So that's a great challenge.
That kind of democracy is somewhat more Roman, isn't it? The notion of representation. I mean, the Romans don't quite have the majoritarian system in most occasions that the Athenians do, but you can, if you're a citizen, vote for the chief magistrate, so you at least have that, and potentially there are citizen assemblies if need be.
Yeah. So the Romans have sort of a mixed, Polybius famously thought it was a mixed government that had monarchical and aristocratic representative type as well as democratic elements to it. The Greeks do have some conception of what we would call representation, but it's not at the center of how they see the thing going. It's not, and so I think it really truly is the great challenge for modern democracies is to maintain that sense of a genuine commitment to something that is commonly held when you're not getting together with your fellow citizens on a regular basis and contributing in your own person to the process.
They also were always living under a situation of existential risk. We don't feel that. Maybe we are today, but we don't feel it.
I think there's a very good case to be made that we are living under a condition of existential risk. But as you say, it's not as short term. It's not that the Persian army is marching south and they intend to
even a rival city-state.
No, exactly right. So it's no, I think one of the big challenges, along with scale, which is the scale is the first great challenge for democracy, and the big question for Athens was, could they scale up to a democracy that had tens of thousands of citizens? The great challenge for us is, can we scale up to hundreds of millions? But the second one, exactly as you point out, is this sense of existential threat. When we see our security as pretty much okay, we're not really worried about that. Then I think we fall into the danger of either fake security threats, which become politically useful but highly divisive, or security threats like climate change, which are so distant that they don't have the same sense of existential threat that leads us to recognize that we have to do things together.
So Athens and other city-states had citizen armies and citizen navies when they had. So the citizenry, I gather, they just didn't turn out at arms at time of war. They must have had plenty of training exercises in order to fight in phalanx.
Yeah, indeed they do.
So they had the experience of standing together in arms, and either as an exercise or in reality, fighting for their lives.
Yes, that's right.
That's certainly very foreign to modern democracy. To them, it's been an enormous bond between the citizenry.
It was, we're not that far away from that. If you think about the time of the Second World War, when a very high percentage of the able-bodied citizenry of various countries participated in a high level of common action that was regarded as
At what age were you excused from taking your place in the phalanx?
We don't have a specific age in which it cuts off. I don't think we have any case of people being called up over age 60.
So you could be pretty old.
You could be pretty old in the phalanx. In fact, generally speaking,
that was beyond life expectancy, actually.
Well, yes. I mean, it is beyond ordinary life expectancy. The great thing about ancient life expectancy is that if you manage to make it into your 20s, you'll have a pretty good chance of getting at least into your 40s. And if you get into your 40s, into the 60s, and frankly, into the 60s, you have a good chance of getting into the 80s because you've survived a lot of, diseases and so on.
You had a heroic
You had a very good constitution. So yes, so we have these people who are, people say, oh well, life expectancy is very short in antiquity, which certainly on the average is true. But then, Socrates, who obviously was hale and hearty at age 70 when he was executed, and we have lots of cases of people living up to over 100.
So if you were a 50-year-old guy, you had, for the last 35 years or so, been periodically kind of turning out and doing exercises with your fellow citizens.
Yeah, I don't know
how often would you have done it? Every month?
Well, it's we don't have a lot of detailed information about how often they're doing military training. They certainly are doing it. But the other thing is, it's not only military things you're doing with your fellow citizens. The way that the Athenian system works is that the whole of the population is divided up into 10 completely artificial, that's translated as tribes, but it has no genetic basis, and it's specifically meant to bring Athenians from different parts of the Athenian territory into a common grouping. And so you did lots of stuff with your tribe members. You fought with your tribe members. You attended the festivals with your tribe members. Every year at the city Dionysia, the festival to Dionysus, your tribe put on 2 dancing and singing choruses, one of the mature men and one of the young men, kind of like a Rockettes thing, in which you all were doing choreographed dancing and singing.
Was this during the showing of drama, or?
Well, yeah, these weren't dramas. These were another thing that happens at the dramas do happen at the Dionysian festival, but these were the men's choruses. So you dance with your tribe, you sing with your tribe, you fight with your tribe, and you engage in politics with your tribe. So you went into your year, if you get chosen in the lottery, and it was quite likely that you would, a year on the citizen council, and you do that with members of your tribe. And your members of your tribe are, in a sense, a representative sample of the whole people.
Did states copy this, or
some of them do. We certainly know that, for example, the nearby city-state of Eretria, which has a good record of documents, does something very similar, and it looks as if this may be one of the key, as it were, institutional technologies that makes democracy work, because it seems to be a way to bring people together into a really close set of association with a subset of their fellow citizens, but a subset that isn't chosen because of religious affiliation or wealth or even geographic location. It's a randomly chosen subset, and you bond together with them, and through them you bond together.
Some of these things are associated, I think, with Pisistratus and Lycurgus.
The tribal system that is the democratic tribal system is put into place after the fall of the tyranny. A couple of generations of tyrants running Athens in the middle of the 6th century, put in place by the democratic reformer Cleisthenes after this big revolutionary moment that really founds the democracy. So he's up against it. He has to come up with something on very short notice that will pull this society together, and comes up with this tribal idea, brilliant idea. Nobody, I suppose, at the time knew if it was going to work, but it turns out to work really brilliantly.
So that's sort of the start point for the Athenian democratic experiment.
Yes, indeed.
And it has a 200-year run with a few interruptions, and it eventually is sort of overwhelmed from the outside by expanding power of Macedon. But what sort of weaknesses does it show along the way, and why finally do the Athenians, sort of the subject of your book, why finally do the Athenians lose their independence, together with the rest of Greece?
Yeah. So this is the book that I wrote on the rise and fall of classical Greece, which was ultimately trying to make the argument that, contrary to what had long been the standard opinion on this, the Greek world experienced a dramatic economic growth from the 8th century BC through into the end of the 4th century BC, so let's say from Ober to Aristotle, and that growth was in the background driven by the development of citizen-centered forms of organization in the context of a ecology of small city-states that were highly competitive with one another. So that the background is that a lot of people had reason to invest in themselves, in their community, as citizens who are not going to be extorted or taken advantage of by their leaders, or at least less so than in other societies. And in a world in which there's a high level of competition, and in which state to state and individual to individual learning is really quite possible, quite easy, so that you can adapt what works for the people next door. And if you don't, if they're doing a lot better than you, they're probably going to end up eating your lunch.
It also suggested that leaders eventually were overtaken.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So Athens is really the at the forefront of the innovations, and Athens becomes, I think, in various ways, the most successful of these city-states. But in its early period of success, in the time of Pericles, the so-called Golden Age, Athens overreaches. Right? So the problem, and this is another thing that think about, is what democracy gives you, what a basic form of democracy gives you, and what it doesn't give you. It doesn't give you a moral sense that you want to use the power that emerges from the capacity of the people to work together and achieve things and solve problems in innovative ways. It doesn't give you a sense that you oughtn't to use that in ways that are exploitative of other people. So the Athenians get out ahead after the Persian Wars. Democracy is generating a lot of capacity, and they use that capacity to basically build an empire and to extract resources from hundreds of other Greek city-states, which works great for Athens for a while, but doesn't work well in the long run.
Is that extracted wealth fairly well shared among the participating citizens?
Yeah, exactly so. It was. I mean, that if we look at this, it's very hard to measure ancient inequality. I've tried to do it, especially for the time of Aristotle, and I think we can push this back some ways. That Athens, as far as we can tell, has a relatively low level of income inequality. Certainly is income inequality. Some people are known to be very wealthy, some people are known to be quite poor, but there's a lot of people in the middle. And this is in part because the principle of democracy is that we're all in this together, and we ought to be sharing in some reasonable way the benefits that emerge from the social cooperation that is made possible by our system. So that when we're sending out the ships, and the poorer members of society are the ones who are rowing the ships, they're the ones who are doing a lot of taking the risk. There can always be storms. Then they ought to get their fair share. We ought to pay them for their service at a reasonable level. when there's a crisis and we need to have internal taxation, we have to raise money from our own citizens, it should be the very rich who are paying those taxes. And that's basically the agreement that is made, that the poor don't pay taxes, they do service, and they're paid for their service. The wealthy are secure in their property. They don't get, the poor don't.
So there's a kind of social compact that
There's
everybody they recognize its nature, and they're going to stick with it.
Exactly so. So you don't have to worry as a rich man that the assembly is going to get together and vote to simply redistribute the property of the rich to the poor. On the other hand, you recognize that the compact is held together by when you're asked to pay money to finance a state warship, you say yes. And if you really want to be a citizen who is highly regarded by your fellow citizens, if you want your fellow citizens to hold you in honor, you say yes in a enthusiastic kind of way. You do more than your share. You don't do everything grudgingly. And so partly
but there was a mutual dependence between the rich and the poor.
Absolutely, yes.
And you needed the poor to turn out in their various capacities and defend the state.
Exactly.
Otherwise,
so.
everybody would be lost.
Exactly
so you had
so.
that going for you.
Exactly so.
Didn't have a professional army or mercenaries or
Precisely right.
things like
Precisely
that.
right. And there was a basic recognition that if the poor are desperately poor, it's not going to work well. And so the redistributive mechanisms are such that the rich maintain substantial wealth, but if you look at the standard indicators of inequality, they're relatively low compared to other pre-modern societies, and frankly compared to now contemporary societies.
So if democracy showed itself to work that well, and if it still works that well, why has it historically, at least, been so rare?
Yeah, so I think the rarity really is partly because it's really hard to get it right. It's hard to get the institutional design right. When the going gets very rough, there's always the possibility that the various interests within the community will turn out to be looking towards themselves rather than the community as a whole. So at a certain point, the rich may be saying, this isn't working so well, maybe a revolution that would put us in charge would be the right thing to do. And this is what happens near the end of this very long Peloponnesian War. After the war, which Athens loses to its rival Sparta, the Athenians then say, we've got to do something, things went wrong, things pulled apart. Both we used our power in ways that were going to get us in trouble, create big coalitions of other states against us. And clearly, the social compact didn't hold in the way it needed to. And basically what they do is readjust the institutional structure of democracy to emphasize rule of law, and to make a distinction between the decisions that the assembly can make just day by day and the fundamental law that will guide those decisions. So the worry is that sometimes when we get together as a group, especially if we have really skilled rhetoricians among our leaders, and they are personally ambitious, they will lead us to enthusiastically approve a policy that turns out to be really bad. What we need is some kind of break on that tendency, and that is ultimately the establishment of what we would call a constitutional system, a system of fundamental law that must be respected when you're making day-to-day policy.
So this might have gone on a good deal longer than
Yeah,
it did.
yeah.
It ends because they're overwhelmed by a fairly despotic state from the outside.
Yeah. So it really is external, I think, rather than internal pressures that take down the democracy. And then the question is well, how did that happen? And I think that the simple answer is that at the neighbors of the Greek world, the various emerging states that exist on the periphery of the Greek city-state world are learning a lot from the city-state world. They're engaged in trade relations, they're engaged in, as we call, academic exchanges. There's a lot of movement around the Greek world, movement of people who are highly skilled in various important ways. Finance ministers, military experts, experts in catapult artillery, and these people are, in essence, available to be hired by some of the neighbors of the Greeks. So the creation of high levels of very specialized expertise and the mobility within the Greek world, the fact that the Greek language then spreads to these neighbors, it's easy to move around and communicate. And eventually, I think it was perhaps almost inevitable that one of these large, basically national empires, like Macedonia, would figure out ways to take on board the kind of specialized skills, for example, in state finance and military organization and artillery, that had been developed in the city-states, and scale it up, and then use it to overthrow the city-state world, which ultimately
without adopting democracy.
Without adopting democracy, exactly. So I think one of the things that we have to remember is that democracy has the capacity to be a highly effective form of human organization. It's not the only effective form of human organization. Autocracies can be highly efficient. They can get a lot done. And historically, many people have preferred to live in an autocracy. They haven't had this intuition that I don't want a boss. So I think to be a sincere Democrat is to recognize that not everyone in the world would choose to think the way that you do.
They still feel allegiant to their state without being
absolutely allegiance to their king, allegiance to the god that their king represents. So there's all kinds of ways to have non-democratic societies that are efficient. They can accomplish a lot. What they think that non-democratic societies have a harder time doing is developing the kind of institutional technologies that the Greeks did. But those institutional technologies are exportable.
So you're kind of doing what I'm going to ask you to conclude with. But to conclude, what would you say are the lessons for our own time, for America?
Yeah. And I think so I guess the core lesson I would say is that we have to recognize that if we believe in democracy, then we have to recognize that along with the various values that we always associate with it, freedom, equality, dignity of the civic dignity, we have to recognize that democracy is a system to sustain security and welfare without a maximum leader, individual or a small coalition. That's difficult to do, and it becomes more difficult at scale. The larger the scale, the more difficult it is. In order to do it, you need to have the right kind of institutional design, and that's going to probably mean continuous tinkering. Doesn't mean you get it right once and it's right forever. The external environment changes. And it means that you're going to have a commitment to some sense of common purpose, some sense that we are in this together, and we do need to get on the same page to sustain the things without which we won't be able to maintain our independence as a democratic community. So it's not just a matter of rights, it's a matter of being willing to take on the costs of being our own collective boss. Those costs are considerable. If we're not willing to pay them, we won't sustain democracy.
Well, we've had our 200 years and a little bit more as the
Yes.
Athenians, and let's hope that when the future looks back on us, they'll be able to draw lessons about how to create a functioning democratic polity, as well as you've been able to draw lessons from how Athens did it.
I entirely concur.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve.